Hey guys, my name is Mac Lake, and I'm really excited to share with you today. I planted a church in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina in 1997, but before that I was at Dallas Theological Seminary in the late 80s. And I remember Dr. Aubrey Melfers coming to me and saying, "Hey Mac, you need to take my church planting class." And I looked him in the eye and I said, "Aubrey, I will never plant a church." And it was 7 years later, I ate my words and I called Aubrey up and I said, "I need some help. I don't know what I'm doing." And he recommended his book, and that really, really helped me. But I love church planters, love church planting. It was one of the greatest experiences of my life. My wife and I did say yes to the call to plant a church in Myrtle Beach, and so we moved up there, and we gathered a team of people, and we began the work, and people showed up. I mean, it just really, really surprised us. And within the year, we had grown faster than we thought we were going to, and a couple years in, it was still growing. And it was about 2 years in, I remember just being struck by a problem. We were reaching all these unbelievers, and we were baptizing people left and right. The problem was I had nobody to help disciple them. We didn't have leaders to lead things, and we started great. We had some great leaders to begin with, but because we grew so fast, we had a deficiency of leaders very, very early on. And that sort of set me on a course to figure out how in the world are we going to develop leaders and have enough leaders to continue to grow and reach people and reach this community. And I learned a lot on that journey. I really began to study how Jesus developed leaders at that point, and it was revolutionary for me. And I want to share some of those things with you. But before I do that, one of the things I want to encourage you with as a church planter is to really define how you're going to develop leaders before you get started. I talk to a lot of pastors and do leadership development with a lot of pastors across the country, and one of the questions I ask a lot is, what is your leadership development strategy? And I only get two answers to that question when I ask it. And so I say, "Hey, what is your leadership development strategy?" And some guys look at me and say, "Well, Mac, to be honest, we don't have a leadership development strategy." And then the other answer is, "Well, Mac, ours is organic," which means they don't have a leadership development strategy. And that was me. I didn't have a leadership development strategy. And when we began to feel the pain of a shortage of leaders in our church, here's what I did. I began to tell the people in our church, "There's a leadership problem in the church. There's a leadership problem in the church." And a few years later, I realized I was wrong. There wasn't a leadership problem in the church. There were plenty of leaders. There were coaches who were leading football teams and basketball teams. There were entrepreneurs coming to our church that were leading businesses. There were people, bank managers that were leading in that context. There were moms who were leading their kids in their home, and all that. There were leaders, and so that's when I really realized there's not a leadership problem in the church. There's a leadership development problem in the church. So if I were to sit down and have coffee with you, and as you begin to think about starting your church, and we spent some time, talking about leadership development, here's 5 things I would tell you, okay? The first thing that I would tell you is pray early and often. Pray for leaders. Pray early and often for leaders. I remember when we were planting, and all of a sudden, we realized we had this deficiency of leaders. I didn't know what to do, and so I just started praying. "God, please send leaders. Please send leaders. We're reaching lost people. They're getting saved, and we need leaders to help disciple them. God, please send leaders." Now, I know that sort of sounds obvious, that start with prayer, but let me show you something. This in Jesus' ministry, very early in his ministry, he did a tour through the region of Galilee. Now, in this region of Galilee, I'm going to draw it like this, and I know it's not to scale, so please forgive me. In this region of Galilee, there were 240 or so, 200 to 240 villages in this region. And so Jesus did a tour through some of these villages, right? Well, it was about 8 months or so later, he recruited his 12 disciples, and he sent them out 2 by 2. And they began to go through this region. And what did they do? They started reaching people. And then later, he divided up again, and had the 72 and sent them through this region to reach people. Now here's what I want you to see. When Jesus sent the 12 and Jesus sent the 72 to see a gospel movement in this area, there's one instruction that he gave the 12 and the 72. The first thing he told them was pray to the Lord of the harvest that he will send forth workers. That's significant. Because when he's saying pray to the Lord of the harvest to send forth workers, he's not saying pray for people to get saved. He's saying, hey, I did a tour through this region of Galilee and I reached some people. So when you go back through this region of Galilee, pray that God will, and that Greek word means to pull somebody to make them do something against their will. So pray for some of these believers that they will step into leadership. And then when he sent the 72, the 12 had already been through here. They reached even more people. And so Jesus told the 72, pray to the Lord of the harvest that he will send forth workers in these villages. So they're praying for leaders. That's where it has to start. There are people that you're reaching that have a call and potential competency to be leaders in your church. But we have to pray for them so that God will do a work in them and God will do a work in us to draw us together to help place them in leadership in your church. Now, the second thing I would tell you as a young church planter, know why you're developing leaders. Know why you're developing leaders, okay? Think about that question for a minute. Why are you developing leaders? Here's the common answer. Gosh, Mac, we're developing leaders. It's obvious, isn't it? We have a shortage of leaders. And we need more leaders. The staff is overworked. Our key leaders are overworked. There's too much. They're trying to do too much. We feel this pain of the shortage of leaders. And so why do you develop leaders? To solve the pain, to fix the problem. But is that why we should be developing leaders? Think about this. What if we're developing leaders because we see potential in people? What if we slow down and we really begin to look at people not as something we can plug into a gap or a position in our church, but we really begin to look at people and look at their personality, look at their gifts, and look at their calling, and look at how God shaped them, and then we begin to develop leaders because we see potential in people. We see potential in them, not the problem that we have, but the potential that they have. And you're developing leaders for that reason. I love what Jesus did when he called his disciples, like with Peter, James, and John. He said, come follow me. I'll make you fishers of men. And when Jesus did that, he was making a time commitment to these guys. And he was saying, I want to help you become everything that God's created you to become. That's why we develop leaders. Third thing I would tell you is start building a culture of leadership development from the beginning. Start building a culture of leadership development from the beginning. Here's what happens. A lot of times you start church and you have enough leaders. Then all of a sudden you lose a leader. You need a couple new leaders. So what happens? You start focusing on leadership development. You find somebody, you recruit them, you put them in that position, and then you relax. You don't think about leadership development again. Okay? And then things are going fine. Then all of a sudden, whoops, got a shortage of leaders again. So you focus on leadership development again, all of a sudden, and you find a leader, you put them in a position, plug them in, and you can relax again. All you're doing is identifying and plugging leaders in. That's not leadership development. That's leadership placement. You're finding somebody that you think is ready, plugging them in, okay? And so what you want to do is you want to build a culture of leadership development from the beginning. Think about what Jesus did again. He recruited his 12. They were following him around. After a few months, he went up on the mountain and he prayed. And when he came down the bottom of the mountain, it's Luke chapter 4, I believe it is. He came down the bottom of the mountain, and here's what the passage says. He called his disciples to himself, and get this, and from among them he chose 12. He called his disciples to himself, and from among them he chose 12. How many were at the foot of the mountain? I don't know. There might have been 100, there might have been 13, but there was more than 12. And so he pulled them together, and he looked among those disciples, and he went, you come follow me, you come follow me, and you come follow me. From among them he chose 12. Why did he do that? Mark 6 gives us the answer. That they might be with him, that they might go out and preach the gospel and heal the sick. And so, in other words, here's what Jesus was doing. From the very beginning of his ministry, he chose 12 men that he could pour himself into to disciple as new believers and then disciple them as leaders so that they could go out and do the mission and live on mission. In other words, Jesus was starting by building a culture of leadership development right from the beginning. So we have to think in terms of not just placing leaders, but how do you build a culture of leadership development? Now, the next thing that I want to share with you is structure for development. So fourth thing I would tell you, structure for development, not just function. A lot of times you put your org chart together and you're just, how do things need to function? So that's what we do. So let me show you this. What I recommend is that you put together a leadership pipeline. Leadership Pipeline is a book by Ram Charan. You don't have to buy the book. I'll give you the whole concept of it really quick, okay? Ram Charan says in every organization, it goes like this. Down at the bottom, you have people who lead themselves. Those people will flow up in the pipeline, and they will lead others. Some of those people will flow up here, and they will lead leaders. Some of those will flow up, and they'll lead a department. And some of those will flow up, and they will lead the organization. Now, Charan says that every turn in the pipeline, every time somebody makes a turn in the pipeline, they go to a new level, they have to learn new skills, new ways to use time, and new values. So you can see pretty quick that if somebody skips from this position to this position, then they're missing something in their developmental process. So what I recommend is that you take this pipeline and you look at this generic pipeline, lead self, lead others, lead leaders, lead department, lead the organization, and define what does that look like in your church from day one. And then you align that across every single position, every single ministry in your church. I'll give you an example of what it might look like, okay? Down here, I might call this the team member level. Here is the leader level. Here, I might call this the coach level. This is your director level, and this is your senior leadership team level. Okay, here's the value of this. When you begin to define your leadership pipeline, now it gives clarity as to where people can be discipled up in leadership in your church. And it also saves you a lot of headaches, because when somebody comes and says, hey, I want to be your student director, then you can go down here and say, well, have you learned to lead yourself? Are you leading a small group? Well, they say, well, no, I'm not doing that. Well, your next step is to lead a small group, okay? And so it just helps, gives you direction and gives you alignment across every ministry by defining your leadership pipeline. Don't just structure for function, but this helps you structure for development. It helps you see the levels that people can be developed to. Now, the last thing I want to share with you is this. Design an intentional, multifaceted approach to leadership development. Design an intentional, multifaceted approach to leadership development. Let me show you this. I don't have a lot of time to go to detail on this, but years ago I studied how Jesus developed leaders, and basically broke it down into 3 parts and then made it applicable to my particular environment. I'll show you how I applied it to my environment, okay? So remember earlier I said, what's your leadership development strategy? And most people don't have an answer to it. Here's one way you can answer this, okay? We're going to prepare leaders through apprenticeship. We're going to prepare leaders through apprenticeship. That's when you're preparing somebody who's not led at a particular level. You're training them, you're apprenticing them to move from the team member level to the leader level, or the leader level to the coach level. It's short term, it's smaller group, 2 to 3 people meeting, and training them through an apprenticeship, okay? And it might be 6 weeks, it might be 6 months, but you're preparing them to lead at a new level. The next thing is equip. Equip is that ongoing training. And what I would do is I would take my leaders and I would huddle with them at least quarterly. And so your coaches are huddling with your leaders. Your directors are huddling with your coaches. And you have huddles going on there at least quarterly where peer-to-peer learning is taking place. And this is just ongoing development. They just keep meeting as long as they're in that leadership position. And then the last part is inspire. There were times Jesus would get 4,000 or 5,000 people together, and the environment was so riveting, people wouldn't even leave to go eat. And so here, I would do in-house conference 2 times a year. That's how I do it. I'd pull all my leaders together a couple times a year and just do inspirational leadership development. So what this little structure does, and you can have different answers over here, just how are you going to prepare your leaders? How are you going to do the ongoing equipping, and how are you going to inspire? These are my answers. You might come up with something a little bit different. Now, let me encourage you with this as we finish up. Guys, leadership development It's a challenge. We want leadership development to be fast and easy and linear, but it's slow, it's messy, and it's customized to the learner. It's a challenge. So keep sticking with it. Use some of these principles and these tips that I've given you, and just keep on improving. Get your team together to talk about what you're doing with leadership development, what's going right, what's not going right, how can we get better at it, and just share best practices with each other so you can continue to get better and better at it. But remember this, leadership development really is about discipling your key leaders. It's pouring into them. It's multiplying them. It's doing discipleship with them. It's not just training people how to turn the ministry widgets so your church machine can run. It's teaching people to live a biblical lifestyle of leadership so that they can live as leaders, mature believers, live on mission in such a way that impacts, yes, the church, but it also impacts their home and the community. That's when you know leadership development is making a significant difference in your church plant.